It started with a single phone call. I was working late at the office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, drowning in a sea of invoices and client reports. My desk phone rang, the sudden noise slicing through the quiet. Glancing at the clock, it was well past business hours. I hesitated before picking up. Hello? There was a pause, then a distorted voice on the other end. Mr. Hughes, this is Samantha from the compliance department. There's a significant irregularity in one of your accounts. Can you confirm a few details for us? I frowned. Samantha? Compliance? It wasn't unusual for departments to cross-check records, but something about the call felt off. Still, I gave her the benefit of the doubt. Sure, what's the issue? Her voice remained flat, almost robotic. A transfer of $1.2 million was flagged in your system. It originated from an unverified client account. We suspect a breach. Were you aware of this transaction? My stomach dropped. That kind of money could ruin us. No, I said quickly. That's impossible. I handle all major transactions personally. Samantha's tone grew sharper. You need to act quickly. Provide your credentials so we can secure the system before further damage is done. Something clicked in my mind. Wait, I said slowly. What's your employee ID? The line went dead. I spent the rest of the night in a fog of paranoia. The next morning, I reported the call to my supervisor, Karen. She dismissed it as a prank or phishing attempt and assured me our systems were secure. But as the days passed, strange things began happening. Invoices I didn't recognize appeared in our records, marked as paid. Clients called to complain about overcharges or unapproved withdrawals. And then there were the emails. Every night, around 3 a.m., I'd receive messages from an unfamiliar address, shadow@control.com. Each email contained fragments of conversations I'd had at work, some from private meetings, others from casual hallway chats. They weren't just transcripts. They were twisted, warped to make it sound like I'd orchestrated a massive fraud scheme. One particularly chilling email read, "We know, Mr. Hughes. The lies are catching up. The missing $1.2 million? Everyone will think it's you. Better start saying goodbye." I forwarded the messages to Karen, but she dismissed them as spam. "You're overthinking this," she said. "It's just someone trying to scare you. Don't give them the satisfaction." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A week later, the hammer fell. I was called into the boardroom, where a panel of grim-faced executives waited. Karen was there too, her usual confidence replaced by unease. The CFO, Mr. Wallace, slid a stack of papers across the table. "These documents suggest you've been funneling company funds into personal accounts. Over $1.2 million is unaccounted for. Can you explain this?" My heart raced as I skimmed the papers. Every signature, every approval, every transaction, it all pointed to me. But I hadn't done any of it. "This is a setup?" I exclaimed. "Someone's framing me?" Karen avoided my eyes. Wallace's expression didn't waver. "We've already reported this to the authorities, Mr. Hughes. You'll need to clear your name with them. By the time I left the building, my entire career was in ruins. My reputation was shattered, and my colleagues looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. I spent the next few weeks spiraling into despair. The police interrogations were brutal, and the evidence against me was airtight. Every attempt to trace the fraudulent transactions led to dead ends. Whoever was behind this knew exactly what they were doing. Then one night I received another email from shadow@control.com. "Do you want to know the truth, Mr. Hughes? Come to 17th and Willow at midnight. Alone." I knew it was a risk, but I had nothing left to lose. The address led to an abandoned office building on the outskirts of town. The windows were shattered and the air was thick with mildew. I stepped inside, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing. No response. I climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, where a faint glow emanated from one of the rooms. Inside, a laptop sat on a dusty desk, its screen displaying a single line of text. "Play the video." My hands trembled as I clicked the file. The footage showed a boardroom, our boardroom. The camera was positioned in a corner, capturing Karen, Wallace, and 2 other executives huddled together. "This will work," Karen said, her voice cold. "Hughes is perfect. He's meticulous, but that makes him predictable. We'll funnel the money through his credentials, and when the auditors catch it, he'll take the fall." Wallace nodded. "We'll distribute the funds after the dust settles. By the time anyone realizes the money's missing, we'll be long gone." My blood boiled as the video ended. The laptop screen flickered, revealing a new message. "Do you see now? They're the real thieves. You can bring them down, if you're willing to play their game." Before I could respond, the laptop powered down. The next morning, armed with the video, I went to the police. But when I handed them the USB drive, the file was gone. Corrupted. Desperation drove me to confront Karen directly. I waited for her in the company parking lot, stepping into her path as she approached her car. "I know what you did," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "I saw the video." Her eyes narrowed. "You're delusional, Hughes. Stop embarrassing yourself." But there was fear in her eyes. Over the following weeks, the messages from shadow@control.com became more frequent. Each one offered new evidence, snippets of conversations and transaction records implicating Karen and the others. But every time I tried to share them, they vanished. It was as if the shadow wanted me to act on my own. One night, I received a final email. "They're meeting tonight to move the money. 10 p.m. the old warehouse on Pine. Don't miss it." I arrived early, hiding behind stacks of rusted barrels. Sure enough, Karen, Wallace, and the others showed up, their voices echoing through the cavernous space as they discussed their plans. I recorded everything. The footage was enough to reopen the investigation. Within days, Karen and her co-conspirators were arrested. The company cleared my name, but the damage was done. My career, my reputation, it was all a shadow of what it had been. I never learned the identity of the person behind shadow@control.com. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear the faint hum of a laptop powering on, and I'd swear I could feel someone watching. Whoever, or whatever, they weren't done with me yet. It started with a bargain bin purchase. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a way to pass time during a lazy weekend. That's when I found it. Eidolon, an old, obscure survival horror game for the PC. The case was scratched and worn, its once vivid cover now faded to muted tones. The back described it as an immersive journey through your worst fears. The store clerk shrugged when I asked about it. "Never heard of it," he said. "Probably some shovelware from the early 2000s. $5 if you want it." I bought it. At home, I popped the disc into my PC, expecting janky graphics and clunky controls. Instead, the game booted with an eerie, minimalist title screen. A shadowy forest under a blood-red moon, with Eidolon scrawled in jagged, flickering letters. No music. Just the sound of rustling leaves and distant whispers. I hit start. The game's premise was simple. You played as a nameless character who woke up in a dark, desolate forest with no memory. Your goal was to escape while avoiding the Eidolon, an ominous entity that stalked you through the woods. The graphics were primitive even for the time, but there was something unsettling about the way the shadows moved. They didn't follow the usual logic of light and perspective. Sometimes they seemed to reach for me, curling like fingers. The first few minutes were standard fare. Gather supplies, find clues, avoid danger. The controls were stiff, and the gameplay was unforgiving. One wrong move, and you'd hear the creatures growl before everything went black. But then things got strange. It started small. The game seemed to react to me in ways I didn't expect. When I paused to look at my map, the screen would flicker and faint text would appear for a split second. I managed to catch one phrase: "You're being watched." At first, I thought it was part of the game's atmosphere. But the longer I played, the more personal it felt. The whispers in the background seemed to grow louder whenever I hesitated or backtracked, as if mocking my indecision. And then there were the notes. Scattered throughout the game were scraps of paper with cryptic messages, clues I assumed to the overarching mystery. But one note made me freeze. "Why did you leave her behind?" It was unsettling because it wasn't part of the game's plot. It was my story. Years ago, I'd broken up with someone I cared about deeply, too afraid to commit. How could the game possibly know that? I brushed it off as coincidence. But the next note shattered that illusion. Remember the lake? The promise you broke? My stomach twisted. The lake. Our lake. I'd promised to meet her there one last time after the breakup to talk things through, but I never showed. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling on the keyboard. Was this some elaborate prank? Had someone hacked my computer? I hit escape, intending to quit, but the game wouldn't let me. Instead, a message popped up. You can't run. Against my better judgment, I kept playing. The game world grew more distorted. The shadows thickened, writhing like living things. The whispers morphed into voices speaking my name. My real name. When I reached a clearing in the forest, the screen froze. The camera zoomed in on a tree, where someone had carved a date into the bark. The day I left her waiting at the lake. I felt sick. Suddenly the Eidolon appeared, a hulking, faceless figure shrouded in darkness. It moved toward me, unnervingly slow. My character couldn't run. The controls were unresponsive. As the creature closed in, the screen filled with static. When it cleared, I was no longer in the forest. I was at the lake. The graphics had changed, becoming disturbingly realistic. The water shimmered under a pale moon, and the surrounding trees swayed in a gentle breeze. I could even hear the soft lapping of waves. On the dock stood a figure. She was facing the water, her back to me. Her hair was exactly as I remembered, long and dark, cascading down her shoulders. I tried to move my character, but the game didn't respond. Instead, the camera panned closer as if someone else were controlling it. When I reached the dock, she turned. Her face was wrong. Hollow eyes, a slack jaw, her skin pale and cracked like porcelain. But her voice was the same. You left me, she said. I slammed my hands on the keyboard, trying to exit the game, but it was useless. You promised, she whispered. The screen flickered again, and suddenly I was underwater. My character thrashed as the Eidolon dragged me deeper into the murky depths. The screen filled with darkness, accompanied by a guttural growl. Then 2 words appeared. Game over. I ripped the disc from my PC and tossed it into the trash. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice. My phone buzzed around 3 a.m. When I checked, I found a text from an unknown number. You can't run. I stared at the message, heart pounding, before deleting it. The next day, I went back to the store where I'd bought the game, hoping to find some answers. But the clerk looked at me like I was crazy. Eidolon, he said. We don't sell that. Never have. I insisted, even showed him my receipt, but he just shook his head. Defeated, I left the store and drove home. When I opened the door, I froze. Sitting on my desk was the game disc, pristine and unblemished. And beside it, a note in her handwriting. You promised? It started with the posters. Missing dog Rocky. They were plastered on every lamp post, mailbox, and telephone pole in the neighborhood. A golden retriever with soft eyes and a goofy grin stared back at me from the grainy photo. Beneath it was a desperate plea from the owner, last seen near Maple Woods. Reward offered. At first, I didn't think much of it. Missing pets weren't uncommon around here, especially with the sprawling woods just beyond our backyards. Coyotes, dense thickets, and steep ravines made it a dangerous playground for wandering animals. But then more posters started appearing. Different dogs, different breeds. All missing. The strange part? Every single one had vanished near Maple Woods. By the 3rd week, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Someone's stealing them, Mrs. Larkin, my next-door neighbor, insisted. I heard they're being sold to underground breeders. Nonsense, said Mr. Thatcher from 2 doors down. Coyotes. I saw one dragging something off just last week. Despite the speculation, no one seemed to have concrete answers. And the dogs kept disappearing. It wasn't until my own dog, Benny, went missing that I started to investigate. Benny was a mutt, a scrappy, energetic bundle of fur who'd been my companion for years. He wasn't the kind of dog to wander off. He always stayed close, especially on our evening walks. The night he disappeared, I'd let him out into the backyard for his usual bathroom break. I turned my back for a moment, just a moment, and when I called for him there was no response. I searched the yard, then the block, then the edge of the woods. Nothing. That's when I noticed something odd. Deep scratch marks near the back fence. They were too large to be from a coyote and too jagged to be from a regular dog. The next day I printed posters and plastered them around town. But as I taped one to a pole near the woods, I felt an eerie sensation, like I was being watched. I turned toward the trees. At first I saw nothing but tangled branches and shifting shadows. But then I heard it, a low guttural growl. "Benny?" I called, my voice trembling. The growl stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then from somewhere deep within the woods, came a long, mournful howl. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that howl echoing in my mind. It wasn't just a dog's cry, it sounded wrong. Distorted, like multiple voices layered on top of each other. Around midnight, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a sturdy walking stick, I headed into the woods. The trees loomed tall and oppressive, their gnarled branches blocking out the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As I ventured deeper, I found more of those strange scratch marks, on tree trunks, rocks, even the ground itself. And then I found the collar. Benny's collar, tangled in a patch of brambles. "Benny?" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. The woods answered with silence. I pressed on, following what seemed to be a faint trail. The deeper I went, the more unnatural the forest felt. The trees twisted in impossible ways, their trunks splitting and rejoining like veins. And then I saw it. A clearing, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. In the center was a large stone slab, covered in deep grooves and markings. Surrounding it were bones, scattered, broken, some still bearing tufts of fur. My stomach churned as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a dumping ground. It was an altar. Before I could process the scene, I heard movement behind me. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. At first I saw nothing. But then 2 glowing eyes appeared in the distance. "Benny?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The eyes moved closer and I caught a glimpse of a figure, large, canine, but wrong. Its body was emaciated, its fur matted and patchy. Its jaw hung open at an unnatural angle, revealing rows of jagged teeth. And then I saw its eyes, not just glowing but filled with an intelligence that didn't belong in any animal. It wasn't Benny. The creature lunged at me and I barely managed to dodge. My flashlight hit the ground, its beam flickering as I scrambled backward. "Stay back!" I shouted, swinging the stick wildly. The creature snarled but didn't retreat. It circled me, its movements unnervingly deliberate, as if it were toying with me. Then from the shadows more eyes appeared. One by one they emerged, twisted, monstrous versions of dogs, each more grotesque than the last. Some were missing patches of skin, others had limbs that bent the wrong way. And yet I could still recognize them. The golden retriever from the poster. The beagle from down the street. Benny. My heart shattered as I saw him. His once bright eyes were now dull and lifeless, his body warped into a grotesque parody of what he once was. "Benny," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. He tilted his head, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. But then the largest of the creatures growled and Benny stepped back, joining the pack. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. Branches tore at my skin as I sprinted through the woods, the sound of snarls and pounding paws close behind. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. Finally, I burst out of the woods and into the open street. The creatures didn't follow. When I turned back, the woods were silent once more. I reported what I saw, but no one believed me. The authorities dismissed it as hysteria brought on by grief. The missing posters were eventually taken down, their edges curling with time. But I knew the truth. Every night I hear them. The howls. The growls. The mournful cries of what used to be our dogs. And sometimes, late at night, I see glowing eyes watching me from the edge of the woods. They're still out there. Waiting. And they've marked me as their next prey. Jakarta, the city that never sleeps. With its bustling streets, glowing skyscrapers and ceaseless chatter, it is alive with activity day and night. Beneath its frenetic energy, however, the city has its secrets, and those who probe too deeply often regret it. I didn't believe in urban legends. Jakarta's so-called haunted landmarks and cursed tales always seemed like fodder for bored minds. Until I started my new job in a crumbling high-rise on the outskirts of the old city. The building was officially called Menara Mandala, but locals whispered a different name, Gedung Bayangan, or the Shadow Tower. Despite its modern construction, the tower had an ominous reputation. They said strange things happened there. Figures glimpsed through darkened windows, voices whispering in hallways where no one should be. I shrugged it off as superstition. People in every city loved their ghost stories. When I landed the job as a graphic designer for a small startup, I thought of it as just another office in the sprawling megacity. But Gedung Bayangan wasn't just another office. It started small, things I could ignore. The first night I worked late, I heard footsteps in the empty corridor. I checked. No one was there. Cleaning staff, I told myself, though I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. Then came the missing items. My pens disappeared, only to reappear neatly arranged in my drawer. A mug I left on my desk moved across the room overnight. Colleagues joked about the Penunggu, the supernatural spirits believed to haunt old buildings. But Menara Mandala wasn't old. It was supposed to be new, cutting-edge even. The stark contrast between its sleek glass facade and the oppressive dread inside was hard to explain. One evening I was working late again, against my better judgment. Deadlines loomed, and I had no choice but to stay past 10 p.m. Most of the building had emptied out hours before, leaving only a skeletal cleaning crew and a few other unfortunate souls like me. The air conditioning had that faint hum only noticeable in an otherwise silent space. I typed furiously, my back aching and my mind hazy. Then, just at the edge of my vision, something moved. I turned quickly. Nothing. Just my reflection in the glass, distorted by the faint glow of the city. I sighed and rubbed my temples. Get a grip, I muttered. But as I turned back to my work, the reflection didn't. For a moment I froze. My hands clenched, cold sweat pricking my forehead. Slowly I turned my head back to the glass. My reflection was staring at me, its head tilted, lips curling into a smile I hadn't made. The office behind it seemed darker, the furniture twisting into unfamiliar shapes. I blinked and it was gone, just my normal reflection staring back wide-eyed and pale. I packed up immediately and left. Over the next week things escalated. My colleagues began complaining too. Someone saw papers fluttering in an office no one had been in all day. Another swore they heard crying in the stairwell late one night. But no one wanted to admit it outright. Something was wrong with Gedung Bayangan. It was Waira, a quiet programmer, who finally broke the silence. I looked it up, he said during lunch one day. This building, they built it on the ruins of a kampung, an old settlement. A fire wiped it out decades ago. Dozens died. Come on, Waira, snapped Ronnie, the HR rep. Every building in Jakarta has some story. Let's not start spreading nonsense. But Waira's words stuck with me. I stayed late again that Friday. A storm rolled in, the city bathed in flashing light and booming thunder. I tried to focus on my work, but every shadow felt like it was alive, every gust of wind like a whisper in my ear. Around midnight the lights flickered and went out. The office was plunged into pitch-black darkness, broken only by the occasional lightning flash. Great, I muttered, fumbling for my phone. As I turned on the flashlight, the beam illuminated my desk, then the hallway beyond it. That's when I saw her. A woman, soaked as if from the rain, her long hair hanging in wet clumps over her face. She stood at the end of the corridor, unmoving. Hello? My voice was shaky. She didn't respond. I took a step closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when she began to walk, slow, deliberate steps, her bare feet leaving wet footprints on the carpet. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. The light spun, casting wild shadows on the walls. By the time I picked it up, she was gone. But the footprints remained, leading down the corridor to the stairwell. I should have run. I should have left the building without looking back. But something pulled me forward, a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain. The stairwell was freezing, the air thick and damp. As I descended, I heard it, faint whispers, too garbled to understand but unmistakably there. The whispers grew louder with every step until I reached the basement. The basement shouldn't have been there. Menara Mandala didn't have an underground level, or so I'd been told. But here it was, a dark, cavernous space filled with old wooden furniture, moldy books, and a faint, sickly green light emanating from the walls. In the center was a large mirror, cracked and ancient. The whispers came from there. As I approached, the reflection flickered, not showing my face but a swirling darkness. Faces emerged, screaming soundlessly, their hands pressed against the glass. And then I saw her again, the woman. This time she was inside the mirror, her face now fully visible. Her eyes were empty sockets, her mouth twisted into a grin that seemed to stretch too wide for her face. Her voice broke through the whispers. "Leave this place," she hissed. The mirror began to crack. I ran. The stairwell twisted and warped, the walls seeming to close in around me. When I burst into the lobby, the lights had returned, the storm still raging outside. I didn't wait to explain myself. I left the building and didn't return. The next day, the company announced its relocation. Structural concerns, they claimed, though no one believed it. Weeks later, I read about Gedung Bayangan again. It was being demolished to make way for a new shopping mall. But as the demolition crews worked, they discovered something chilling beneath the foundation. A charred wooden frame, remnants of what appeared to be an old home. Inside they found dozens of skeletons, their bones twisted and broken. The news never made the headlines, but whispers spread across Jakarta. Gedung Bayangan's secrets weren't buried deep enough. And even now, when storms roll in and the city goes quiet, some say you can hear her, the woman from the mirror, whispering warnings to those who dare to disturb her rest. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow fell in gentle flakes over the sleepy town of Winter Hollow. Every street glowed with warm golden light from garlands wrapped around lampposts. Children's laughter echoed through the chilly air as families finished their last-minute preparations. The atmosphere buzzed with joy, as it always did this time of year. Except at the old Holloway house at the edge of town. For decades it had sat abandoned, its roof sagging under years of neglect. But this year something was different. The lights were on. I first noticed it when walking home from the local bakery. My arms were heavy with bags of cookies and festive treats, but my steps faltered as I passed the overgrown path leading to the house. Through the frosted windows, faint light flickered inside. "Strange," I muttered. No one had lived there since the Halloways disappeared on Christmas Eve 30 years ago. I was a child then, but I still remembered the whispers, how their entire family vanished without a trace. How their Christmas tree stood untouched for weeks, its lights burning out long before the police sealed the property. Most people in Winter Hollow avoided the house, calling it cursed. But now curiosity pulled me closer. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching in the snow. Through the cracked window, I could see a Christmas tree, its ornaments glinting in the flickering light. It wasn't just light. The tree was fully decorated, complete with gifts neatly wrapped beneath its boughs. My heart pounded. Who had decorated it? The front door creaked open as I stepped onto the porch. A gust of cold wind pushed it wider, as though inviting me inside. Against every instinct I stepped in. The air was frigid, far colder than it had any right to be, and it carried the scent of pine needles and something metallic like old coins. The living room looked untouched, as though it had been preserved in a glass case for 30 years. The Christmas tree was the centerpiece. Its lights blinked rhythmically, casting the room in alternating shadows and soft golden hues. Beneath it, the presents bore faded tags with scrawled names: Ellie, Thomas, Mommy, and Daddy. But the oddest thing? The ornaments. They weren't the shiny baubles or candy canes you'd expect. They were faces. I leaned closer, my breath fogging in the icy air. Tiny, delicate faces carved into porcelain hung from each branch. Wide eyes stared blankly out, and small mouths curled into perfect eerie smiles. Goosebumps prickled my skin. The faces looked too lifelike, as though someone had captured their expressions in a moment of terror. Then I noticed the writing scrawled on the wall behind the tree. Thin and jagged, as though scratched by trembling hands, it read, "Do not take the gifts." I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but my curiosity overpowered my fear. I knelt beside the tree and reached for one of the boxes. It was light, too light for a real gift. As my fingers brushed the paper, the room seemed to exhale a frigid breath, and a low hum filled the air, a soft, mournful sound like someone singing from very far away. I hesitated. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the cold. The humming stopped. Suddenly, the tree lights flickered erratically, and the room plunged into darkness. My heart raced as the sound of footsteps creaked above me, slow, deliberate, pacing across the upper floor. "No one's supposed to be here," I whispered, backing toward the door. Then came the laughter. Childlike giggles echoed from the hallway, followed by the faint rustle of movement behind the tree. I turned toward the door to bolt but froze in my tracks. The porcelain ornaments now dangled at eye level, their once blank expressions twisted into wide, toothy grins. Their eyes followed me. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaking. The giggles grew louder. A flash of movement darted in the corner of my eye, something small, quick, and impossibly fast. The footsteps from upstairs thundered now, barreling down the staircase. "Get out," a raspy voice whispered behind me. I turned and saw her. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned holiday dress, her face pale as the moon and her eyes sunk in hollows. She stood by the tree, her bony hand outstretched. "Leave," she said, her voice layered with anger and sorrow. Without hesitation I ran. The cold night air stung my face as I fled down the driveway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my house. I locked every door and window, praying to forget what I'd seen. But that night, as the clock struck midnight, a faint, rhythmic knock sounded at my door. I didn't answer. The next morning, Christmas Day, I found a package on my porch. It was neatly wrapped with paper that felt old and brittle. My name was written in elegant script on the tag. I didn't want to open it, but my trembling hands betrayed me. Inside was a single porcelain ornament. Its face was my own. The twisted smile and hollow eyes were unmistakable. And as I held it, I swore I could hear humming again, soft, distant, and unrelenting. It was the last field trip of the school year, and the students of Ridgeway High were buzzing with excitement. The buses were packed, teachers were yelling to keep everyone seated, and the smell of sandwiches and sunscreen filled the air. Destination: Black Hollow Nature Reserve, a sprawling, forested expanse known for its rugged trails, ancient trees, and eerie legends. Most students were thrilled about the escape from routine, but not Anna. She sat quietly by the window, staring at the dense trees in the distance. Something about Black Hollow unnerved her. The bus rattled to a stop at the edge of the reserve. The dense woods loomed overhead, their canopies blotting out the sky. "Stick to the trails," Mrs. Carter, the science teacher, barked. "And for heaven's sake, stay in groups." Anna trailed behind her classmates as they filed off the bus, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. She felt watched, though every time she turned around she saw nothing but the endless rows of trees. "Come on, Anna," her best friend Lily called, grabbing her hand. "You've been moping all day. This is going to be fun." Anna forced a smile. "Yeah, I guess." But deep down she couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. The first part of the day was uneventful. They toured the visitor center, where a guide droned on about the local wildlife. They ate lunch at picnic tables surrounded by towering pines, the occasional squirrel darting by. It wasn't until after lunch that things got strange. Mrs. Carter led them on a trail deeper into the forest, pointing out flora and fauna as they went. The sunlight dimmed under the thick canopy and the air grew colder. The students whispered among themselves about ghost stories they'd heard, about how campers sometimes disappeared in these woods, leaving behind only whispers of laughter on the wind. Anna tried to stay close to Lily, but the crowd grew chaotic as kids darted off to explore. Stay on the trail? Mrs. Carter shouted, her voice tinged with frustration. Then, somewhere ahead, a shrill scream pierced the air. The group froze. What was that? Lily whispered, clutching Anna's arm. Probably just someone trying to scare us, a boy named Jake muttered, rolling his eyes. But when the scream came again, sharper and closer, the laughter and whispers stopped. Everyone stay together, Mrs. Carter ordered, her voice quavering. She marched forward, herding the students like sheep. As they rounded the bend, they saw a backpack lying in the middle of the trail, its contents spilled, papers, snacks, a phone. It's Mark's, someone said. Where is he? Mrs. Carter picked up the bag, her face pale. Stay here, she said. Don't move. She handed her whistle to one of the older students and vanished down a side trail. The minutes dragged on. The group grew restless. Maybe he's just playing a prank, Jake said, trying to sound confident but failing. I don't think so, Anna whispered. She stared into the woods, the shadows between the trees shifting like restless figures. A rustling came from the bushes ahead. Everyone froze, expecting Mrs. Carter. But what emerged wasn't their teacher. It was Mark, or what was left of him. His skin was pale, his eyes glazed over as if he were in a trance. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his mouth hung slightly open. Mark? Lily cried, rushing toward him. But Anna grabbed her arm. Don't. Mark moved jerkily, like a puppet on invisible strings. He stepped onto the trail, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. The group stared, paralyzed by fear. Then he spoke, or at least something spoke through him. You're all here to play, he said, his voice an unnatural, echoing monotone. Don't stray. The forest doesn't like when you stray. The students screamed and backed away, but Mark took another step forward, his movements inhumanly stiff. What's wrong with him? Someone whispered. We have to go, Anna said, pulling Lily toward the trailhead. The others hesitated, torn between fleeing and waiting for Mrs. Carter. But when Mark, or whatever controlled him, grinned, revealing teeth far sharper than his own, the decision was made. They ran. Branches slapped at their faces, and roots threatened to trip them as they barreled down the path. Anna's heart pounded in her chest. Behind them, the sound of heavy, irregular footsteps echoed in pursuit. They stumbled into the visitor center, breathless and panicked. But something was wrong. The ranger who had greeted them earlier was gone. The building was eerily silent, the air thick with the smell of pine and rot. Where is everyone? Lily whispered, clutching Anna's hand. We need to call for help, Anna said, pulling out her phone. But the screen was filled with static, the time blinking midnight over and over. Before they could process what was happening, the lights flickered. A deep voice rumbled through the air, vibrating the walls. You left the path, it said, each word dripping with malice. The door slammed shut. The windows darkened, as though night had fallen in an instant. One by one, the students were swallowed by shadow, their screams cutting off abruptly. Anna clung to Lily, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to die here, Lily whispered. We won't, Anna said, though she didn't believe it. In the end, only Anna and Lily remained, huddled in a corner. The shadows crept closer, their movements deliberate, predatory. A voice, Mark's voice, whispered in Anna's ear. The forest always takes its share. The shadows lunged and the world went black. Days later, the buses were found parked neatly at the trailhead. The teachers and students of Ridgeway High had vanished without a trace. Search parties scoured Black Hollow, finding only scraps of belongings scattered along the trails. Among them was Anna's notebook, open to a single page. Stay on the path. It's the only rule. We didn't listen. No one dared to enter the forest after that. The trails were closed, the gates locked. But on cold, quiet nights, locals swear they can still hear the laughter of children carried on the wind, mingled with screams. The year was 1846, and the Austria Empire stood at the zenith of its power. Its boundaries spanned vast lands, each territory rich with history, art, and secrets. Vienna, the empire's gleaming capital, was a hub of innovation and culture, its palaces brimming with grandeur. But beyond the imperial facade lay whispers of something darker, stories shared in hushed tones over flickering candlelight. Adalbert Gruber, a scholar with a passion for forgotten lore, arrived in Vienna one stormy autumn night. He was called there by a cryptic letter bearing the seal of the Imperial Archives. It had been signed by an archivist, Franz Malz, whom Adalbert knew only by reputation. The letter hinted at a discovery, something ancient, tied to the empire's origins and shrouded in mystery. It spoke of a curse within the foundations, urging Adalbert to come quickly and help unravel its meaning. Intrigued, he packed his belongings and boarded the first carriage to the city. When he arrived, he found Franz waiting at the door of a crumbling archive building hidden in Vienna's back alleys. The archivist, a pale man with sunken eyes, wasted no time. He led Adalbert inside, through endless corridors of brittle scrolls and dusty tomes. Franz stopped at an iron door etched with unfamiliar symbols. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What lies beyond is unlike anything we've ever seen. Be warned, Adalbert, what we uncover tonight might be dangerous to know." Adalbert's curiosity outweighed his fear. The door creaked open to reveal a dimly lit chamber. At its center stood a podium holding an aged manuscript. Its pages were inked with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly as though alive. "This is the Codex Impero," Franz explained. "It predates the Austria Empire by centuries. Legends say it contains the truth about the empire's rise, a truth the Habsburgs have hidden for generations." Adalbert reached for the manuscript. His fingertips brushed its surface, and an unnatural cold seeped into his skin. Ignoring the sensation, he opened the codex. The symbols on the page rearranged themselves, forming coherent words as if adapting to his mind. What he read chilled him. The codex told of an ancient pact made by a Habsburg ancestor, Wilhelm the Wretched, who had bargained with a shadowy entity known only as the Pallid One. Wilhelm, desperate for power and an empire that would span ages, had promised the Pallid One a tribute. But the text did not specify what the tribute was, only that the consequences of failing to uphold it would be dire. Franz, standing behind Adalbert, turned pale as he read over his shoulder. "There's more," Franz said, his voice trembling. He pointed to a passage describing a cycle. Every 70 years the tribute had to be renewed, or the empire's foundations would rot from within. Adalbert's stomach twisted as he did the math. "The last cycle was in 1776, he murmured. 70 years? Franz whispered. Adalbert's blood ran cold. It was 1846. As if on cue, the ground beneath them rumbled. Dust fell from the ceiling and a low groaning noise echoed through the building. "The tribute," Franz gasped, "is due. And it hasn't been paid." Their panic was interrupted by the sound of distant footsteps, growing louder. Franz grabbed a lantern, gesturing for Adalbert to follow him. They fled deeper into the archives, the manuscript clutched in Adalbert's trembling hands. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, and the light from the lantern flickered wildly. Shadows moved unnaturally along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. Eventually they reached a hidden staircase spiraling downward. "There's a chamber beneath the archives," Franz said. "The codex might tell us how to fix this." They descended into darkness, the air growing colder with every step. At the bottom they found a vast hall filled with statues, marble effigies of Habsburg rulers, their faces eerily lifelike. Adalbert opened the codex again. The text shifted violently, forming jagged lines that took moments to settle into words. It revealed that the tribute required was not gold nor land but blood, a sacrifice of imperial lineage. "What does that mean?" Adalbert asked. Franz hesitated. "If the sacrifice isn't made, the empire itself will collapse." Before they could process this, the statues began to stir. Their heads turned toward the two men, stone faces cracking to reveal hollow eyes. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the chamber. "The time has come. Where is the tribute?" Adalbert and Franz froze. The statues advanced, their movements stiff but purposeful. "The Habsburgs broke the pact," Adalbert said, holding up the codex. "We're just scholars. We don't—" Silence, the voice boomed. The pallid one emerged from the shadows, its form shifting constantly, a mass of featureless gray that exuded malice. "You meddle with forces beyond your understanding," it hissed. "If no Habsburg offers their life, the empire shall crumble." Desperate, Franz spoke. "The emperor, he must be told. He could." "It is too late," the entity replied. "The foundations are already cracking. The rot has begun." As if to prove its point, the ground split open, revealing dark tendrils that coiled around the statues, dragging them into the abyss. Adalbert flipped frantically through the codex, searching for a solution. A final page formed before his eyes, its words glowing ominously. "Sacrifice delayed is sacrifice doubled." Realizing the implication, Adalbert turned to Franz. "We have to warn the emperor. If we can't stop this, the empire—" The chamber began to collapse, stone falling around them. Franz shoved Adalbert toward the staircase. "Go. Take the codex and go." "What about you?" "I'll buy you time," Franz shouted, turning toward the pallid one. "Tell the emperor what you've seen. Maybe he'll listen." Adalbert hesitated but obeyed, fleeing up the stairs as Franz faced the entity. The last thing Adalbert heard was Franz's scream, echoing through the collapsing archives. Adalbert emerged into the cold night, clutching the codex. Behind him, the archive building crumbled into rubble, leaving nothing but silence. He spent the next few days trying to reach the emperor, but every messenger he sent vanished without a trace. Rumors spread of cracks appearing in the imperial palace, of strange shadows stalking the halls. Adalbert realized the truth too late. The tribute would never be paid. The Austria Empire was doomed not by war or politics, but by its own foundation, a pact with an ancient force that now claimed its due. And as the empire crumbled, Adalbert could only watch, knowing he'd uncovered the truth, but powerless to stop it. The flame towers of Baku illuminated the dark sky, their light dancing eerily over the Caspian Sea. Azerbaijan's capital was alive with its bustling streets and vibrant culture. Yet, beneath the surface, there were whispers of an ancient curse, a secret so buried in the folds of history that even mentioning it seemed to awaken a chill in the air. Adil Mammadov didn't believe in such things. As an archaeologist, he prided himself on facts and evidence. Superstitions, folklore, they were mere stories to him. But a recent excavation in the mountains of Gabustan had unearthed something that refused to be brushed aside. It started with an odd artifact brought to his attention by his colleague Layla. A small, blackened stone with carvings unlike anything they'd seen before. The engravings seemed to depict a fire rising from the earth, consuming everything around it. "What do you think this means?" Layla asked, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. Adil turned the stone over in his hands. "Primitive art. Probably some old myth about fire. It's Azerbaijan, land of flames. Fire worship has deep roots here." Layla hesitated. "I don't think it's that simple. The locals warned us not to disturb this site. They said the whispering flame lies beneath it." Adil chuckled. "Whispering flame. Sounds like a ghost story." But as he examined the artifact further, the edges of the carvings seemed to shimmer faintly under the flickering lantern light. His laughter faltered. That night Adil couldn't sleep. His apartment, overlooking the Caspian, felt unusually cold despite the mild weather. As he lay in bed, his mind kept drifting to the stone. Its carvings seemed etched into his memory, repeating themselves endlessly whenever he closed his eyes. A faint sound broke the silence. It was subtle at first, like wind rustling through the grass. But as it grew louder, Adil realized it wasn't the wind. It was a whisper. He sat up, heart pounding. The whispering seemed to emanate from his work bag, where the artifact was stored. Summoning his courage, he approached it. As he unzipped the bag, the whisper stopped abruptly. The stone lay there lifeless. Adil shook his head, trying to dismiss the unease settling over him. "Just my imagination," he muttered. But he decided to leave the stone in the office the following day. At the dig site, Layla greeted him with a strained expression. "Adil, something's not right." "What happened?" he asked, still unnerved from the night before. One of the workers. He disappeared last night. He said he saw flames in the distance and went to check. We found his hard hat this morning, but no sign of him. Adil frowned. Flames? Out here? Layla nodded. The locals are blaming the whispering flame. The whispers returned that night, stronger this time. They spoke in a language Adil couldn't understand, but their tone was commanding, insistent. He tried covering his ears, but the sound burrowed into his mind. Suddenly, his room lit up with an unnatural glow. Adil turned to see flames flickering in the corner, dancing with a sinister vitality. Yet they didn't burn, they seemed to ripple through the air, defying physics. A shadow emerged within the flames. It was humanoid but elongated, its features indistinct. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. You have awakened us, a voice boomed, its origin indistinguishable. Adil stumbled back, his heart racing. Who, what are you? The figure in the flames didn't answer directly. Instead, it raised a hand and visions flooded Adil's mind, ancient rituals, sacrifices to a fiery deity, and a city consumed by flames. The whispering flame cannot be silenced, the voice declared. It hungers. The next morning, Adil rushed to the excavation site, clutching the stone. We need to close this dig immediately, he told Layla. She looked at him, puzzled. What's going on? It's real, he whispered, his voice shaking. The legends, the whispers, it's all real. We've disturbed something we shouldn't have. Before Layla could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A fissure split the earth, and from it erupted flames, brighter and more intense than any natural fire. The workers screamed and scattered as the flames seemed to chase them, forming shapes, faces twisted in agony, hands clawing toward the sky. Adil dropped the stone and the whispers ceased. But the flames remained, towering over him. That night, Baku's skyline shimmered with an ominous glow. News spread of strange fires consuming the excavation site and unexplained disappearances. Adil and Layla were never seen again, but their story became another whisper in Azerbaijan's long history, spoken of in secret with averted gazes. Some say the whispering flame still lingers in the mountains, its hunger unsated. And on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you might hear it whisper your name. New York City never truly sleeps. The ceaseless hum of traffic, neon lights, and the chatter of millions creates an endless pulse of life. But as vibrant as the city appears, there are dark corners. Hidden places where the noise dulls, the light dims, and something far older than the skyscraper stirs. Sarah Bennett, a recent transplant to the city, was still adjusting to its chaos. She had taken a tiny studio apartment on the Lower East Side, a steal by Manhattan standards. The previous tenant had moved out in a hurry, leaving behind a few belongings, including a peculiar, dusty journal. The journal was old, its leather cover cracked and brittle, its pages yellowed. It had no name or markings to indicate ownership. Sarah found it intriguing, and after unpacking she decided to leaf through it. The first few entries seemed ordinary enough. Daily musings, notes about the city, mentions of favorite diners and parks. But as she read further, the tone shifted. February 3rd, I saw it again tonight. A figure standing at the edge of the street where the streetlights flicker. It doesn't move, doesn't approach, but it watches. I can feel its eyes even though I can't see them. February 8th, the shadow followed me home. It doesn't like the light, but my apartment feels darker somehow. I hear faint whispers when I'm trying to sleep. Sarah paused, her heart beating faster. She looked around her dimly lit apartment. The single bulb overhead flickered faintly, but she dismissed it as old wiring. The journal became an obsession. Every night after work, she would read a few more entries. The writer described a growing paranoia, encounters with the shadow figure becoming more frequent, its presence more oppressive. February 14th, I tried to leave. I packed my bags and went to Penn Station. But every street I turned down, every subway I entered, it was there. Waiting. Watching. There is no leaving the city now. Sarah began noticing things in her own life. Flickering streetlights. Shadows that seemed to stretch just a little too long. The feeling of being watched even in the crowded subway. One night, she awoke to the sound of whispers. They were faint, barely audible but unmistakable. She sat up, her eyes darting around the room. The journal lay open on her nightstand, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze, though the air was still. February 20th. It doesn't need to hide anymore. I see it in the corners of my apartment, its form blending with the shadows. It's getting closer every night. I don't think I'll last much longer. Sarah slammed the journal shut. She decided it was just her imagination, a mix of stress and late-night reading. She shoved the journal into a drawer and resolved to forget about it. But the shadows didn't forget about her. The following week, Sarah's life became a nightmare. She would find herself standing in front of her apartment building with no memory of how she got there. Her reflection in mirrors seemed delayed, as if the image were lagging behind her movements. The whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, even the air around her. Words she couldn't understand, spoken in a language that felt ancient and wrong. One night, desperate for answers, she retrieved the journal. The final entry was dated February 28th, nearly a year ago. It's here. There's no escape. It's part of the city, part of the shadows. It feeds on us, on our fear, our loneliness, our despair. If you're reading this, it means it's chosen you now. I'm sorry. Sarah dropped the journal, her hands trembling. A cold wind blew through the room, extinguishing the light bulb overhead. The whispers turned to a low, guttural growl. She turned toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed impossibly dark. A figure began to emerge, a silhouette, tall and humanoid, its edges flickering like smoke. The figure stepped closer and Sarah backed into the wall, her breathing shallow and ragged. "You can't leave," a voice said, deep and resonant. "You belong to the city now." Sarah's neighbors reported hearing screams that night, but when the landlord entered her apartment the next morning, it was empty. Her belongings were still there, untouched, but Sarah was gone. The journal lay on the nightstand, open to a new entry. The ink was still wet. March 1st, the city took another. It always does. Beware the shadows. They are alive and they are hungry. To this day, some say New York isn't just alive with energy but with something darker. Something that thrives in the cracks of its towering skyscrapers and the dim alleys between them. If you ever feel watched in the city that never sleeps, you're not imagining it. And once it notices you, there's no escape. For Emma, her blanket was her comfort, her shield from the unknown. It was the only item she'd carried through every phase of her life, stitched with care by her grandmother, its patchwork of fabric squares each told a story. She used it during chilly winter nights, draped it over herself during childhood thunderstorms, and even brought it to college. It had never let her down. Until now. She'd recently moved into an old Victorian house, nestled on the edge of a quiet town. The house had charm, creaky floorboards, high ceilings, and a faint scent of lavender in the air. But the nights were unrelentingly cold, and the blanket that once provided her warmth felt heavier than ever. The first night, Emma tossed and turned. The room felt off, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. Her blanket felt suffocating, as if the weight of the years stitched into it had compounded somehow. Dismissing it as moving day nerves, she pulled the blanket tighter and tried to fall asleep. But sleep didn't come easy. She dreamt of her grandmother, sitting by the fire and sewing, as her face grew progressively darker, her eyes reflecting flames. When Emma woke, the blanket was bunched up tightly around her neck, pinning her to the bed. Her breathing was shallow, heart racing. She convinced herself it was just a bad dream, a coincidence. The second night, Emma made a mental note to relax before bed. She poured herself a glass of wine, watched a feel-good movie, and placed a small night light in the corner of her room. That should do it, she thought. Wrapping herself in the blanket, she tried to let its weight soothe her. The patchwork pattern stared back at her, reminding her of simpler times. She smiled and closed her eyes. Somewhere around 2 a.m. the weight grew unbearable again. This time she couldn't lift it. Emma panicked, thrashing underneath its grip. It clung to her like a vice, forcing her deeper into the mattress. Her arms, her legs, everything felt trapped. The blanket was moving. Beneath its fabric, something shifted and pressed against her body. She screamed, finally managing to shove the blanket to the floor. It landed in a heap, quivering as if alive. Emma didn't dare pick it up. She slept on the couch that night, wrapped in a different throw. In the light of day, things seemed clearer. Stress, she told herself over her coffee. It has to be stress. Determined not to let a blanket ruin her peace, she gingerly picked it up off the bedroom floor. Nothing moved, it felt limp, lifeless. The patchwork smiled back at her, innocently nostalgic. For all the years it had been with her, Emma had never truly examined the blanket. She flipped it over and ran her hands along the seams, but something felt wrong. One square, a faded crimson one, was rough to the touch, its fabric worn thin. Had it always been that way? She pressed against the square. It sunk inward, almost like there was space beneath it. Unable to ignore her curiosity, Emma grabbed a pair of scissors and began to cut the stitching on the crimson square. As she peeled it back, something fell out, a lock of hair, long and silvery white. It was tied with a piece of string. Her stomach churned. No, she muttered, shaking her head. It had to be her grandmother's hair, kept there for sentimental reasons. That was the explanation, wasn't it? Yet beneath the hair she found more, a small scrap of fabric soaked through with a brownish red stain and a brittle piece of paper with something scrawled on it in faded ink. Keep it quiet. Keep it warm. Don't let it wake. Emma dropped the blanket and staggered back, her hands trembling. She couldn't just leave the blanket there. Night came too quickly in the old house and the shadows crept in early. Despite every rational instinct, she felt drawn to it, as though abandoning it might be worse than keeping it. She tried to sleep again on the couch, the blanket folded and tucked away in the linen closet, but her dreams wouldn't let her rest. She saw her grandmother again, only now her face was featureless, a blank expanse. She held up the blanket in gnarled hands and spoke, her voice hollow and distant. You broke the seal, Emma. You can't let it out. Not here. Emma awoke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. Her heart sank as she turned to face the linen closet. The door was wide open. The blanket wasn't where she'd left it. Faint whispers echoed through the house, growing louder, more urgent. Shadows pooled in corners where there shouldn't have been darkness. When Emma stepped into the living room, the blanket was there, sprawled across the couch. It seemed stretched unnaturally, as though the fabric beneath was swelling. Something moved inside, and the faint shape of a hand pressed against the surface. Keep it quiet, the whispers repeated, now clear, overlapping in chaotic layers. Emma covered her ears, backing away. The crimson square glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The shape inside began pushing harder against the fabric. A sound, wet and ripping, came from the blanket. I didn't mean to," Emma cried out, unable to look away as the stitches snapped one by one. A blackened, skeletal hand tore through the fabric, dragging its frail body into the room. Its head was hollow, its eyes deep voids, and its bony fingers clutched at the air, reaching for Emma. She ran. She didn't stop to grab her keys or phone, just bolted into the night. When she reached the main road, the house seemed to shimmer, its outline flickering as though it were no longer fully part of this world. Behind her, the whispers continued, louder now, chasing her. That night, Emma slept in her car, parked at a gas station miles from the house. Days later, police arrived to investigate her abandoned home. All they found was an empty house and a tattered blanket lying in the center of the living room. Its crimson square had faded completely, leaving no trace behind.